All right, I think I'm going to get started with our introduction, and we'll just let people join as I do that. So, hello everyone, and welcome to PGTME's fifth annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Aiden Ilness. I'm the program coordinator of PGTME, and I'll have our moderators and panelists will be introducing themselves shortly. We're so grateful to have you all here for our fifth year of hosting this event and the final session of this week. We're always impressed and inspired by the diverse group of attendees and thoughtful engagement. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health and funded in part by a gift from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. You can learn more about PGTME, on our webpage, and John will drop a link to that in the chat, as well as information about how to join our mailing list and stay up to date with our work. We're very excited to hear from the speakers for today's panel about data sharing in the gene therapy space. If you're unable to attend any of the talks or missed any throughout the week, we'll be posting captioned recordings once the whole session series has concluded, and we'll share a link with all who have registered. Today's event will feature brief introductions by our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed at least 15 minutes for audience Q&A, and we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A feature throughout the entire panel. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our moderator for today, Dr. Rebecca Lee, who is Executive Director of Vivli, a global data sharing nonprofit and a lecturer at the Harvard Medical School, to introduce herself and the rest of the panel. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Aiden, and for you all for inviting us here today, and welcome. I'm delighted to be here with our esteemed panel. Again, I lead the Vivli effort as our CEO, a global data sharing platform that shares trial data. And we're delighted to have you here for a really important discussion on data sharing in pediatric gene therapy. Our panelists with us here today are Dr. Singh, Pat Furlong, and Dr. Tim Yu, and they're here to share their insights, followed by a moderated discussion. So just to kick off, effective data sharing plays such an important role in advancing the study of rare diseases, particularly in the area of pediatric gene therapy. As we all know, the impact of data sharing for rare diseases in particular is amplified due to limited patient populations and fragmented research efforts. Much of this data tends to be siloed away, and a lack of comprehensive knowledge about disease mechanisms and progression tends to happen. Today, we'll discuss some of the success stories in this area, as well as some of the challenges. Certainly, we all hope that data sharing in these patient populations might lead to enhanced diagnostics or perhaps even speed up the path to treatments, especially allowing the pooling of genomic and clinical data across diverse patient cohorts. I lead the Vivli global data sharing effort, and honestly, we have thousands of trials, but so very few of them are in this intersection of rare pediatric and gene therapy. So this is likely due to the very many challenges, which we'll also discuss today, and will potentially drive towards hopefully some implementable solutions in this important space. To start with, I'd like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, to share their interest in this area and topic, and present a short case study on a success story in this pediatric rare disease gene therapy data sharing space to begin this session. So Pat, would you kindly start us off?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this. I'm Pat Furlong. I'm president and CEO of Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. This is an organization now 30 years old that's been investing in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and actually Becker and female carriers for 30 years. We have long desired gene therapy to replace the missing dystrophin protein, recognizing that the AAV serotypes that are targeted to muscle or in general do not have the carrying capacity for this full-length dystrophin, which is 79 exons or 2.4 million base pairs. So out of that, the field has really moved into looking at people who have Becker muscular dystrophy and have remained relatively asymptomatic, and from their genetics, developed a synthetic microdystrophin that would be within the carrying capacity of the AAV virus. And I'm happy to say today that we now have a full approval of 4 years old and up for Elevidys, which is our gene therapy delivering microdystrophin. I think the importance of data sharing crosses this so significantly and what we learned from other studies. And so I'll give you two short briefs of what we've learned. Prior to the advent of gene therapy studies, Pfizer conducted a study on an anti-myostatin. The study was terminated for lack of benefit. And at the end of the day, the patients and families were incredibly disappointed, as we all are when any study is terminated for lack of benefit. In that, we went to Pfizer and said, what data can you share with us from that study that would be and could be applied to a gene therapy study? From there, Pfizer was very willing to share their troponin I data, which would give us some insight into what the impact of viral load would be on the heart, let alone the dystrophin, the microdystrophin protein. So with that data normalized to understand where are these patients at baseline and do they change over a period of time, that data was able to help us take a look at the cardiac changes that occur from the viral load initially and later on in integration. So that was one area of data sharing that really helped us accelerate the investigation of gene therapy. Finally, sort of on the other end of the spectrum, with people receiving ELEVIDYS at this moment and participating in other gene therapy studies, there is the expression of dystrophin, and that is sometimes adjusted or not adjusted, but parents don't really understand the expression of gene therapy and what that means. They get a percentage of expression, a mean percentage, and the real question is, how does that percentage impact my son's trajectory of this disease? And so trying to really standardize in some way the expression data so that we can clearly understand it and furthermore connect the dots between expression and functional benefit is really going to be about not siloing data and in fact sharing data widely across our understanding of gene therapy so that we can fully explore both the benefit and risk of a genetic therapy in Duchenne.
Thanks so much, Pat, for those two case studies. I was part of the original Pfizer team for that drug, so it's very gratifying for me to hear that the data was shared. And thank you so much for those very inspiring stories.
Yes, it was terrific of Pfizer. We have found them to be very good partners. And as you probably know, they terminated their gene therapy study. So
Yes.
I know they're in the process of full analysis. And once that is complete, we are very hopeful they will share what they've learned.
Yeah, I am as well. Singh, would you like to share your case study next?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm Kanwaljit Singh, and I'm the Executive Director of International Neonatal Consortium and Director of Pediatrics at Critical Path Institute. So our work in general at CPATH, specifically at INC, focuses on encouraging pre-competitive collaboration with regulators, industry stakeholders, academic researchers, patient advocates, to address, the challenges specific to drug development for multiple neonatal and pediatric conditions. Where everything that we do at CPATH and INC focuses on data sharing. So this is basically what we do on a day in and day out basis. And I'm really personally very passionate about the power of leveraging data and sharing data to overcome those barriers which exist because there are a lot of silos in this area, and they actually hinder effective development of treatments in rare pediatric diseases, including gene therapies. Honestly speaking, I don't think the challenges that we've seen in data sharing and data siloing and how solving those challenges can actually help accelerate drug development is any different from non-gene therapy conditions, and with versa, gene therapy related interventions. I think the challenges and solutions are exactly the same. One of the case studies that I really wanted to share with you guys is our very successful data sharing initiative focused on neonatal conditions. I realize, it's not gene therapy, but it is definitely gene therapy adjacent. It's pediatric conditions. The exact challenges that people have, I know, with sharing their data and convincing people to share their data are basically exactly the same challenges that we face every single day in the space of neonatology also. And I think the lessons that we've had are very much translatable to the gene therapy space. So this real world data analytics platform project that we developed at CPATH with the help and active participation of FDA, EMA, European Medicines Agency, and a lot of academic stakeholders from multiple children's hospitals within and outside of the US. Was focused on acquiring electronic health record, raw electronic health record data from neonatal intensive care units. This project was so successful that I think we have what we would call it as the world's largest repository of neonatal electronic health record, de-identified neonatal electronic health record data, close to 400,000 NICU patients across 30 different data contributors. We wanted to initially focus this on some of the most important unmet needs in neonatology space, such as bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which is a entirely different thing altogether. But the idea is we were able to very successfully engage with stakeholders, convince them that, and actually, it was not quite so much as engaging with clinical leads at each individual hospital, but I guess the lawyer side of the things, legal side of the things, where we had to convince people that sharing your electronic health record data is not going to violate privacy of the patients. We are going to be de-identifying the patients at source. We will have robust data governance structures. We basically were able to convince them that sharing your data actually makes the data more valuable to everybody. It's a more of a win-win proposition to everybody. And we were able to, as I told you, 400,000 de-identified patient level records from like multiple major children's hospitals, like Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and you name it, and hospitals in Japan and UK. We were able to get a lot of data integrated. We actually have so much data that we find it difficult to actually curate now because we just have way too much of it. Although, as I said, our example focuses on neonates rather than pediatric gene therapy directly, but underlying challenges and the learnings are basically pretty much the same. We have exactly the same type of issues in neonatology too. There's a lot of data fragmentation. There are small data sets. There are ethical issues, and people sometimes simply do not want to share their data because they don't share data. It's not in our policy to share data, right? We were able to actually solve some of those issues by convincing people that it's a win-win scenario. You share your data with us. We're going to make this data more useful than it was before, and it actually will end up helping everybody. As I said, that it's very much our example is very much translatable to gene therapy. The same issues with the fragmented and sparse data in neonatology and gene therapies. We were able to use the data to create some solutions, very specific solutions like predictive models and clinical trial endpoints. We were able to foster this pre-competitive collaboration that did not exist before. And because it was pre-competitive, we were not really focusing on any given specific disease, like specific drug development program, rather than focusing on the science of it. People were, including people from industry and academic stakeholders, were very much, I would say, happy and comfortable with sharing their data, right? We have exactly the same type of ethical and privacy considerations in the gene therapy arena as it exists in the neonatal population. We were able to solve those issues too. Ultimately, the biggest kicker in this was the fact that we were collecting this data not simply for the purpose of aggregating it, but for using it for a very specific purpose. Like in this specific case, we wanted to use it to create natural history studies for BPD, clinical trial endpoints for BPD. So once you do it like this way, I think a lot of people, their hesitancy in sharing their data gets quite a bit decreased. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the example that I wanted to share with you. But obviously happy to answer questions further on in this panel about that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that insight. And I especially was inspired by how you're able to overcome some of the resistance of the key stakeholders in sharing their data. Thank you so much, Singh. And can you be more specific on how you were able to overcome the resistance of some of those key stakeholders in the pre-competitive space? Because I know how difficult that is in overcoming the resistance of the key stakeholders. I think I also have some of those key challenges, and it's difficult, number one, to bring diverse stakeholders together, even if it is pre-competitive, and to overcome some of the resistance to sharing.
So yeah, so the way we approached this discussion was not, I mean, there were a lot of examples where we were talking to and approaching people who I did not know before, who were not a part of our consortium, right? It's relatively easy if I have a member who is already part of our Critical Path Institute and our consortium and talking to them because they're familiar with CPATH and they know we are going to be putting their data to good use, and this is not like simply for a purpose of some sort of commercial benefit or anything like that, right? The challenge specifically arose when we were talking to people who we did not know. So the way we approached that discussion was not approach them with the idea of data sharing at all in the first instance. We approached them and saying that we would like to collaborate with you. This is a consortium of relevant stakeholders from industry, academia, and whatnot. We would love to talk to you about our program and how we have really made tremendous advances in the field of neonatal drug development. If you approach the discussion in that sort of a non-threatening way, people would be willing to listen to you. So we give them the idea of INC, the work that we have done and the extensive network that we have. And then maybe in the second discussion, follow-up discussion, we approach the idea that we have this new initiative focused on solving these intractable challenges in neonatal drug development. And the only way we can actually potentially solve these issues is by engaging in a data sharing initiative focused on in this instance, it was electronic health records, but it can be pretty much anything, right? Natural history studies, clinical trial data, and so on. And we basically told them that, look, we all care for exactly the same thing. I care for neonatal drug development. I care for premature babies. And I know that you also do exactly the same. I think it's going to be in everybody's benefit, your benefit, our benefit, if we would engage in this data sharing discussion with you. They were curious to listen more. We gave them a lot of other examples from CPATH that look, this is not only in neonatology. We have these very successful programs focused on other adult conditions, other pediatric conditions, which might be rare or non-rare, it doesn't matter. And we have this 20-year track record of taking in the data, making the data more useful by combining it with other data sets and making these large databases that subsequently everybody can access. And we have actually used this data to create these specific solutions and specific tools like clinical trial endpoints and biomarkers. We want to do exactly the same in neonatology too. I know we can do it, if you would only collaborate with us. And actually, we were able to get data from sites that they said that it's in their policy to never share data. Like, there are a lot of hospitals in California that do not share data with us, but we were able to get actually there are raw electronic health record data from those sites too. So I think it's you have to tell people that what we are doing is actually going to be in your benefit. If you would only collaborate with us, this is probably the best way to overcome the hesitancy.
Wow. I mean, that's so interesting. The importance of, encouraging trust across these stakeholders is really.
Absolutely. I think encouraging trust and telling them that your data stays in good hand. And I think the track record also helps a lot. That we were able.
And the reputation of CPATH is, of course, so important. So
Yeah.
thank you for that insight. Tim, would you like to
Thank
share
you.
next?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Tim Yu. I'm a neurologist and geneticist at Boston Children's Hospital. And for the last 5-6 years, we've been working in an unusual new space in genetic therapies that has been named the N of 1 space. These are N of 1 genetic therapies that are being developed for individuals, mostly children, with seriously debilitating or fatal progressive conditions for which that are currently not attracting any commercial interest. And this work is being done under an FDA guidance, which was launched in 2020 for individualized drug products, specifically for this type of clinical indication. And to date, there have been, to my count, 27 patients who have been dosed with first-in-class therapies. These are patients with conditions that, again, for which no existing approved therapy exists. And in the great majority of cases, there's no commercially sponsored investigational therapy otherwise available. So where are these therapies coming from? These therapies are largely being advanced by academics like myself, working at academic medical centers like Boston Children's Hospital, like Columbia University, like University of Massachusetts, to get out of the Northeast, like Rady Children's Hospital, Colorado, St. Jude's. And they're also being advanced through the efforts of nonprofits, and in many cases also patient and disease foundations that are helping all work together towards making this happen. And what's allowing these therapies to be advanced, and again, 27 is on one hand a number we're proud of, but it's also a drop in the bucket. What's allowing these therapies to be advanced is that they're being deployed with an agreement to focus in on a common platform for developing the therapy using a programmable type of genetic medicine called, in this case, antisense oligonucleotides, which can be precisely targeted to different parts of the genome and repurposed in such a way that different antisense oligonucleotide drugs share many of their basic properties and pharmacologic properties, their stability, their biodistribution, and their safety in common, although not all of their properties. But this type of banding together is what's allowing these therapies to be produced and then deployed and then used in patients for these otherwise untreatable conditions. And we hope it's the beginning of something good. Rebecca, you had invited us to talk about success stories around data sharing in this space. I will submit that this space optimistically is a success story in progress. We're not there yet. I would say that the initial cases that advance in the space, for which our research group was fortunate to have sponsored a good number of them, they all began out of the sense of collaboration enabled by the fact that this was something different. That in the drug development space, with commercial entities needing to actually generate value for their investors and to protect assets with patents and trade secrets, to protect the profitability of and the promise of return to their investors. That, fortunately and unfortunately, is not at stake for these ultra rare or individualized therapies. And I think that allowed us to crack the door open by recruiting collaboration from many parties who were maybe not able to formally share, but were able to informally share or advise or support various aspects of this type of drug development. I think that the real question is, as this field grows, and as we are able to develop these pilot therapies for these ultra rare conditions, we do need ways of sustaining this beyond academic, nonprofit, and foundation-led efforts. And the real question is that as we come up with models for sustainability, what are the sorts of IP protections? Is IP protection a portion of that stable model, or is it not? And I think that in my mind that actually taking a different approach towards intellectual property and sharing of know-how and so forth is going to be one of the keys to unlocking growth in this space. I think that data sharing, personally, I believe that the data sharing for this long-tail rare disease that's not currently being addressed needs to adopt an open source type of model that will allow really fantastic synergies between traditional and meritorious commercial drug development for large populations and this other class of disorders that currently isn't being served. We and others founded a group called the N of One Collaborative, a nonprofit that is devoted to helping promote growth in this space. And through lots of discussions within this group, this is the model that we've settled upon. And we have thrown out a data sharing pledge to the community that many people have now signed to be able to share information about how these drugs are developed, how they're and how the responses to these drugs in patients are observed. I think this is critical for responsible drug development in these conditions to care for the safety of our patients. And it's also, I think, critical to really fulfill our pledges to the patients that we learn as much from each of these instances as we can. One of the critical points of these programmable platforms is that there's real synergistic learning from each case. In industry, we might see 5 ASO drugs for larger indications being deployed over a period of 5 years. And that's an amazing success, and it's also a commercial success. In the N of 1 space, I envision in a time when we'll see 500 or 5,000 of those ASO drugs being deployed over 5 years, each of which will have a small denominator, a small N of patients involved. But we will, by sharing, learn much more actually from that breadth of experience than from the deep and narrow trials that are run for common diseases. There's as much or perhaps even slightly different learnings from those that we can apply. So I'll pause there, and I'm happy to go into more specifics as the discussion goes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, a couple questions for you is, of course, your work with Millicent and others are so inspiring, and given the uniqueness of each one of these cases, and I'm inspired by the fact that you've actually thought about data sharing up front. Sometimes in these rapidly evolving new spaces, data sharing is really last in line of what people think about. But it's great that you and your team have thought about that up front and realize how important it is. Do you think there's any special data sharing considerations or obligations because of these ultra rare therapeutics that you're developing, and that you might want to think about up front?
I think that one of the really critical aspects here, I mentioned that these are efforts that are advancing currently under programmable modalities, in this case, antisense oligonucleotides. But we know that very soon these will also be advancing for other types of programmable modalities, siRNAs, eventually CRISPR gene therapies, maybe mRNA someday. And I mentioned that one of the characteristics of this class of modality is that multiple drugs within the same class share more properties than more properties are similar than are different. But the fact is that we need to learn the rules for which drugs are safe, which drugs are well tolerated, which drugs are well distributed, and which ones are not, because it's not perfect. Not every drug works exactly the same. And currently, one of the scientific challenges in bringing these drugs to patients is that we rely heavily on imperfect animal testing and in vitro testing and modeling to make those predictions. And sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes those models lead us astray, and they definitely increase the cost of development, and they also restrict the access by making it resource intensive. We think that through these N of 1 or small disease population trials, that we will actually learn from the most relevant experience, which is the clinical experience, and that those sorts of learnings will be so much more valuable. But we also have to flag that that's actually such an important resource. It's contributed by the patients that we're partnering with, who are actually bravely volunteering to take these medicines, and they are being taken with the knowledge that this is still an early bleeding edge type of field. And so we have extra responsibilities to make sure that the learnings aren't sequestered, right? One specific scenario, if I may say, is that we don't want, under any circumstance, that an entity that might be, say, really interested in polishing a platform for $1 billion molecule, in order to make $1 billion molecule, unfairly take advantage of a small orphan population to get better with the technology. And I think that this has to be really carefully discussed and balanced and negotiated so that everyone goes in with eyes wide open. And there are tendencies when you're going after the $1 billion molecule to say, well, whatever we learn from this, we need to keep to ourselves, because we need to make sure that we're the ones who get the $1 billion molecule, not competitor X, Y, or Z. And I think that kind of, while maybe financially understandable, that kind of thinking really falls down when it comes to working with these really special populations. I think these patient populations demand that. I think that that's and they deserve that that these programs be treated differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is how do we maintain commercial incentives while still driving forward some of these therapeutics?
And I think our traditional sense of commercial incentives, our traditional models for delivering commercial value so that it's sustainable and investable, don't work. And so as we think about if we think from first principles up and we say, you know, what's right by the families, right, what's right by the patient communities and the disease communities, and if we say let's fix the fact that sharing of this knowledge is going to be a requirement now, and let's build a financial model around that. In the computer industry, we do this all the time. Companies, by and large, have learned that it's not smart to develop a new programming language all of their own that they will not share with anybody, their own secret sauce. And they use they use common languages that are built on open standards to build incredible software edifices. That's not the case. That's not the case in biotech, where we build these languages that are kind of kept within the walls of a single entity, by and large. That's how how their corporate strategy is constructed. But you know, I think there's room for something different for this
Of
case.
course. Yeah. So let me ask you a question to the entire panel. So again, as I said, we have thousands of trials that are shared on our platform, but really just a handful in this category. And one reason when I push on companies to share their smaller, gene therapy studies, one pushback I get is that, privacy, patient privacy is a major concern, especially in small gene therapy or rare disease cases where they think that patients are inherently potentially identifiable. How do we get around this challenge? And then I'll just throw this open to the panel. When
Start.
there's
It's
yes, of
been
course.
our experience that patients are not worried about their privacy in this regard. In rare diseases where there is a progressive and obviously well characterized, in our case, timeline for loss of function, these children and their parents really desire therapies. And to the extent that they can share their data with people who are very willing to take this forward, I think is really critical. So I don't think it sits with the patient side of things. I think they're more than willing to share data, and in fact, encouraging people to share their data so that we can look holistically at these young, in our case, primarily men or young boys, to see what are their needs and how do we halt progression of this disease and enable them to reach for whatever dreams that they might have. But also, I think, to encourage innovation in this space. And I think Dr. Yu has talked about this exactly because in rare diseases, while they're going after the high numbers, there are any number of people that could benefit from a similar strategy, and they're left behind. And often the conversation with these companies is, once we get these approved billion-dollar drugs approved, we'll think about you at the bench. Well, time against progression is an unfair situation to be in for any patient. So I think what they're doing with the N=1 collaborative and other similar approaches, I think, is exactly where we need to go. And these will be shared learnings. What they learn in that case will apply to that billion-dollar drug.
So from my
Thank you,
perspective,
Pat. Thank you, Pat, for your insights and such an impassioned story from you. Yes,
from my
Singh.
perspective, I think, it all goes down to, yes, rare conditions, gene therapy clinical trials, always a challenge with patient privacy. But as Pat said, in most vast majority of the cases, patients themselves are actually pretty okay with the idea of data sharing. The way it actually probably it did not used to be the case before, but now I believe in the recent years, in the past 10 years or so, the consent forms that patients sign at the beginning of their participation in a clinical trial or a research study actually explicitly has language that I'm okay with my data being shared for purposes other than this specific research study that I'm actually participating in right now. Once you have that consent issue resolved, there really should not be any challenge or any issue on the part of the person who actually holds the data. That will basically going to be like the company or the entity that is sponsoring the clinical trial from actually sharing the data. Now, I realize that the issues pertaining to privacy of the patients are actually there, but the purpose of this data sharing and integrating and aggregating data from multiple different sources is by itself is going to be, resolve at least partially the issue of patient identification, because now what you're doing is you're aggregating data from multiple different sources into one data
Right.
source. And if there's a good amount of at source data, the identification algorithms applied, you can always make a very reasonable case that we are able to reasonably successfully mitigate the issues of patient privacy being violated. But ultimately, yes, rare diseases, people have to go into this with the understanding that this is not going to be a case where you have like tens of thousands of patients worth of data being collected and integrated, and the chances of patient being identified are close to zero. It is not going to be the case in this specific instance. But as long as patients themselves are okay with the idea, because they also understand that my data being shared is actually going to eventually lead to a much more successful and earlier treatment coming to the market. There really shouldn't be any excuses not to share the data, so to speak.
Yes, and you have really a unique perspective from where you stand when you're aggregating data across these diseases at RDCA DAP, right, Singh?
Yes, absolutely. We within RDC DAP we have integrated a few 100,000 patients, I believe, at the very minimum, of multiple different types of rare diseases. This is what it does, right? And the way we de-identify the data, we aggregate the data. Actually, it makes it really easy for all of those privacy-related concerns to disappear.
Mhm. Yeah. And Tim, you mentioned that you're sharing, the approaches to drug development, but are you actually sharing patient data itself? That was one thing that I was going to ask you.
Absolutely. So under the N of One Collaborative, we've developed two different agreements. Granted, they're in draft status, not in finalized status. But one is for the sharing of preclinical data that supports drug development, and that's actually really valuable know-how for the field. The second is for the clinical learnings from individual cases. To kickstart this, I mentioned the number of some 27 patients now having been dosed, about maybe half of them just in the last 6 months or a year, which is pretty remarkable. Our lab has been responsible for 6 of them, and 6 of the most long-running cases. Those are the earliest cases. And just to get things started, we've built we built a database of all of the clinical outcomes, measures, clinical research forms, et cetera, from our 6 patient experience to get us, again, just to get us started. And which is consented fully for sharing with the with the community. And we hope that this is where that exists, and we are looking to extend it via a centralized IRB to multiple institutions and to get this ball rolling.
Thank you. So circling back to you, Pat, you're so close to, of course, the Duchenne community. In the context of gene therapy for Duchenne, how can data sharing and, of course, long-term follow-up in the patient follow-up enhance our understanding of the disease, the relationship between expression levels, therapeutic efficacy, and durability, for example, the percentage of microdystrophin correlate with patient benefit? What can we learn here from data sharing perspective?
So I think we can learn that we can look holistically at this young man. For instance, many of these patients are participating in other studies. They might be in an imaging study, they may be in a cardiac MRI study, and integrating this data gives us a robust picture of how is this young man responding to gene therapy and what other therapies might be additive for him. So I think the siloing data prevents that holistic look. And in fact, I think even as they participate in these other studies, some of these young men face, for instance, if a cardiac MRI, for example, is included in their daily care, in their semi-annual care, and it's included in another study, such as an imaging study, and they may be participating in long-term follow-up of a gene therapy that may require similar testing, these are 3 individual tests that this child might undergo in a single short period of time. So sharing these data will enable us to, first of all, have the data, decrease the burden on this young man and his family, and then enable the physicians to make really sound judgments about what happens next. I think that is inherently such a problem for these families, and they're often criticized for medical tourism, but
Hmm.
logically, there are experts in different areas that are very necessary, and certainly studies going on that are also very necessary to understand fully the impact of any given therapy. So I think this really requires data sharing so that we are appropriately treating these young men with the best care and therapies possible.
Thanks. So how do you think, I mean, so tapping back on that, how do you think we can best empower families to understand the power of data sharing? Do you think that they're fully informed about how important this is?
I wouldn't say that 100% of the families really understand data sharing, but I will say when you're diagnosed, when you have a diagnosis of a rare disease, and I can only speak for your children and not for an adult, being myself. But I think what you quickly learn is you have to become the expert. And you as a parent are trying to drive forward, really make very important decisions. And I often hear patients say, I want to get in the right clinical trial. Well, by
Mm.
definition, you don't know what the right clinical trial would be, right? We just don't have the data to understand that. So I think you quickly become willing to share and interested in the idea of sharing, because then you're on social media sharing with others. Does your son have this particular genetic mutation? Does your son see this doctor? Does he have a cardiac MRI or other testing that is relevant here? And what can we learn? So I think that the diagnosis for most people requires you to get actively involved and advocate for your child. And that
Mhm.
requires understanding not only of his position or her position, but also how we can learn from others with similar genetics and modifiers, et cetera. So I
Mhm.
do think in at least in the world I live in, we are very interested and willing to data share. And I will say further, we are now as an organization beginning to think about the children's oncology group model and how can we gather several or many of these clinics together with required data sharing into a platform such as you have. Because I think it's the only way forward to fully understand the trajectory and the genetic variability in these diseases.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing.
Can I add? I love this
Of
question and
course.
Pat's response. It's this is such an important conversation with families, and it's also really helpful conversation with families because we all know about the possibility of therapeutic misconception. In
Yes.
a and in the most minded version, a patient enrolled in an investigational clinical trial, choosing the right trial, thinks that, oh, I'm going to get treated, and that's it's as simple as that. And that the idea that there is something experimental about it might be in the backs of their minds, and maybe on the front of the paperwork, but in the backs of their minds. I think that in a way, this discussion about the importance of the sharing the results of what happens actually helps kind of solidify and anchor that discussion and point out that we are still learning with each of these, and that not only um, are we still learning, not any one entity may not have all the tools necessary to extract the learnings that you're generating by participating in this trial, that you may actually have to share it broadly, that concept of sharing it broadly. Oh, my doctors will figure it out. Oh, this company will figure it out. Well, no, maybe actually that's not, maybe that's overconfidence. And that could be a very understandable overconfidence on the part of a participant. So in a way, having this data sharing conversation is actually a way to help educate the families that it does take a village to figure all of these things out and to see these patterns.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I
Tim.
think there's this, honestly, there's this sort of a very delicate balance because, as Pat said, most patients, most families do not really deeply understand the concept of data sharing. And the time when the idea of sharing the data comes in is when you're actually consenting the patients, right? So it becomes like, how long of a discussion that you want to have with these families during the consent process. I think it's a sort of a very delicate balance where you have to not only on the one hand have a really thorough and deep discussion about the ins and outs of the study and how my data might be shared in the future or might not be shared in the future, and where it'll go, and what the benefits of sharing the data is going to be, with the fact that will the families actually sit down with you for perhaps, like, 1 hour duration and talk about the intricacies of data sharing. We've seen these cases. I think these type of issues are more prevalent in the cases of acute care, where families do not really have that much of time or patience at hand to actually get into these type of discussions, versus some other conditions where, more chronic conditions where you are able to have, like, sit down with your patients and parents and discuss those type of issues. So it has to be very contextualized. It has to be by case basis. But yes, families do need to be educated. No matter how much you educate, it's never probably going to be enough.
Yeah, and then I'm starting to hear more about the dynamic consent process where, it's not just a static consent at the very beginning of a trial, but it
Yeah.
is.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It has to be kind of something that it definitely cannot be like do it and forget it sort of a thing. Yeah, we got your consent like 6 months ago, and now we're good. I think you need to have periodic conversations with those families.
Yeah, of course. So I'm not sure. How do any of you think that new technologies that are on the horizon? So for example, in my world, there's a lot of talk about, for example, digital twins or synthetic data. We're even starting to get those types of data sets in. There's quite a few barriers, but these could be very promising in, genetic therapies or for pediatric genetic therapy data sharing. There are some barriers to adoption of these technologies, and they might be addressable. But I think they could be very successfully implementable in these N of 1 cases of rare diseases. Have you thought about these technologies being scalable for use in these particular populations and individualized therapies? Or are they far off enough that not really present day?
I think there are two aspects to it. Yes, and I know the reason you are asking this specific questions about digital twins is the fact that it's not, for some of these rare conditions, it is not really feasible to do like a one-to-one sort of a control arm in your clinical trials. So having an option to rely on historic or synthetic data set to control your intervention arms is actually a good idea, right? And I do think there's a lot of precedence in the regulatory sphere where regulators are actually reasonably okay with using external historic controls in some of these gene therapy clinical trials. If you have like single arm clinical trials, if you have good biomarkers and good external historic controls. But you have to be very careful to think about what specifically you're talking about as a comparator. Are you talking about actual real patient data, contemporary patient data, like from other sources, whether it is real world data or whether it is data coming from control arms of untreated patients from clinical trials, or whether it is like purely a synthetic data, right? I think you're going to end up having like a very vastly different conversations with the regulators. My understanding would be when you're talking about actual real patient level data, irrespective of where it is coming from, you're gonna, for some of these ultra rare diseases, the appetite, again, I'm not a regulator, but this is what my understanding is, the appetite is going to be quite a bit different versus if you're talking about entirely synthetic data. I think there's going to be a lot of hesitancy, and we need to be very, very careful. And I believe for some of these synthetic data sources, we're probably a bit far off. It is much more easier to use actual real patient data to be used as a external comparator.
Yes, absolutely. That makes sense. Anyone else before we move on? Okay. Unfortunately, as we run trials, we know that most trials are not positive, but they're negative trials. Any thought to do with, and Pat, you gave this wonderful example of the Pfizer drug, the anti-myo drug. what to do with data from, those trials that are not positive or are dropped from development?
First of all, I think the patients who participated deserve to understand the full analysis of the study. And also I can imagine, Dr. Yu will hear from patients that ask, how is my particular son or daughter, how did they respond in the trial? Because as a mom of two boys with Duchenne, you always wanted to know even if the trial failed, was there any sort of area of hope that my son might have responded to that intervention? That doesn't get you the intervention, but it does give you some insight into the responsiveness of an individual to a given intervention. And then if you're interested and advocate for other similar interventions, that might be a pathway to hope for you. So I do think full analysis of the trial and sharing the data and sharing that individual patient's data back into their chart also gives insight into how this patient responds. So I am thrilled with Pfizer and the way they handled the anti-myostatin trial. We now have the momentum study of Sarepta has failed, and I'm hopeful Sarepta will do the same thing with the PPMO that really seemed to provide some benefit to the patients, although the peptide conjugate was really harsh and created some side effects. So I think, again, we can learn so much about this that could be shared widely, that could, I would assume, help that billion-dollar drug as it's developed, and also come back and help the opportunity and the willingness to do an N equal 1 for patients and families. I know that we've spoken to some companies about this, and they, again, are very reluctant until such a time when they have so many approvals in line, which comes back to time and loss of progression or loss of function. So I think this is really critical. Terminated trials are such a blow to families because we have this hope that whatever therapy has gone through whatever animal models and suggested benefit. And then when, as Dr. Yu mentioned, we know many of them just fail because we don't have the right models or they aren't equal in any way to the human response. So I think that we owe it to these patients to understand fully what occurred there so that we can apply that knowledge going forward.
Thank you.
Terminated trials are so important to learn from. And why don't we start with our original trial, the Mealison trial? Our Mealison trial lasted 3 years because while administration of a personalized drug for a patient with the progressive neurodegenerative disease did improve her quality of life and suppress seizures for the first 2 years, she eventually did pass away in year 3. And to just close the book there and to close the trial and to not bring back learnings from that would have just been unimaginable. In our case, we were able to, with the gift, an incredible gift from the family, to delve deeper and understand exactly why that trial failed ultimately in year 3. We looked to see if there was evidence of the drug the body having developed resistance to the drug, and we did not fail to find evidence of that. We looked to find evidence to see if, well, maybe the drug got in, but it wasn't doing anything. And we were able to demonstrate through analysis of those tissues that it was present, it was biodistributed, and it was actually doing exactly what it was supposed to. And so we were able to pinpoint the reason for the failure, which is that we started the drug too late. And that's a kind of lesson which is you can't underestimate the value of that. There are 15 different reasons that a trial may fail, and being able to even rule out 1 or 2 of them, or much less pinpoint the exact reason, is so incredibly valuable. Being able to have systems where we commit, though, to more rapid turnaround of those results from terminated trials is probably actually critical to making this work, because the reality is for companies that when a trial is terminated, they have to busily put themselves towards working on the next project. And the Pfizer example, Pat, you mentioned is fantastic. But there are also these incentives that make it hard for that team to then, well, sit down and say, well, I'm going to pull all the data together and I'm going to analyze it carefully and then go through the 2-year publication process to put it out into the literature. It just takes a lot of time, and with other things happening, you can see why many times that doesn't happen. But that's why, that's why Vivli, that's why CPATH, that's why these sorts of efforts are so valuable, to make it easier and lower the bar.
And I
Yeah,
would,
of course.
and I would also say, presumably those failed clinical trials will have a source of those untreated patients that I was just talking about, right? That if handled properly can actually help the conduct of subsequent clinical trials much easier by potentially considering those untreated patients as external controls. So
Yes.
I think those failed or even successful clinical trials, getting their data is always going to be a really good idea.
Absolutely. So let's go to some of the questions from the audience. So the first one is, what about the panel's opinion on whether the all boats rise euphemism is realistic when there's such a diversity in stakeholders' interest or focus? For example, some are far more interested in protecting their perceived IP, for example, preventing sharing, versus other stakeholders in the group who might prioritize sharing, which is important to them, for example, safety and natural history data and gene therapy development programs. So how to manage this tension when you have a stakeholder group where some don't want to share because of their interests or IP, and others are interested in sharing.
I really do believe in the idea of, basically rising tide lifts all boats and everybody wins. It actually really is true. Even if there are going to be examples where there are stakeholders or entities or organizations that do not believe in data sharing. Okay, well, it's honestly speaking their loss. Is but my stance to this situation is because, okay, so it really goes back to how you are pitching the idea of data sharing with them, right? Are you pitching the idea so that in a way that you if you are giving them these sort of thoughts in their background that this data is going to be shared and our IP is going to be leaked, and we are going to be naturally at a disadvantage in our hyper competitive field where everybody is basically in their day jobs competing with each other and not even willing to look into or talk to other persons, right? If that is the approach that is being used in your data sharing initiatives, then obviously, naturally, logically, you're gonna be failing in convincing those companies. But if again, in your case at Vivli, or in the case of CPATH, where we're able to tell people that there's been a long-standing precedence, maybe not in pediatric gene therapy because this is an upcoming field, and there are a lot of unknowns and known unknowns in this area. But in many other cases, the idea of these large-scale data sharing initiatives has very successfully pushed the field forward, which would have otherwise never been able to do, without those data sharing initiatives. Your coming out of the silo is actually going to help your own drug development effort so much better as compared to if you were just working alone and not even talking to each other. In vast majority of the cases, you would be able to overcome the hesitation. uh, it's a different discussion in academic side of the things, but as far as industry side of the things is concerned, we have been able to successfully lobby those reluctant stakeholders and share their data.
Thank you. Pat or Tim, have you had to manage these disparate or tension between different stakeholders?
We have struggled with academic centers being willing to share data. Even in our policy manual for our grants, we request data sharing, and often it isn't that we find that the individual we're funding or we're providing support for the grant is reluctant. It is the institution itself that seems to be very protective based on the fact that there is the belief that this could be licensed at some point in the future. In terms of companies, as you might imagine, we have met with companies and asked about looking at rare exons, for example, in our space, and they are reluctant until such a time when they will feel comfortable and then matching that time against an individual's progression in this disease. I wish, and maybe Dr. Yu can do this, there was a new model where there were protections for that drug that's going to serve a certain percentage of the community or all of the community other than a subset. If we could develop such a model, I think that I know that we would get behind such a model to protect that. We certainly respect innovation, and companies need to protect, and companies need to make money and obviously their share and serve their shareholders. On the other side of this, there are so many people left behind, and it doesn't, in a rare disease or in a common disease, it feels like we should be fighting for every life. And so I would hope that we can develop new models.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Here, and perhaps I'll say just that I don't think that I would very much like to decree that rising tides lift all boats, and that should be the rule for all drug development. But apparently, I haven't been given that power, and I would say I probably don't. I don't deserve it, but it's probably actually not even the right answer. I do think it has to be just carefully negotiated. I think that it is going to be context dependent. And I think that there are some cases when we might decide that, competition is good. Competition actually does allow us to develop amazing drugs, ACE inhibitors, statins. It has a real purpose. And in systems and for patient populations for which the system is working, well, let's keep doing it. And then for parts of the medical world where the system is not working, like the long tail of rare disease, and where there are these platform opportunities to aggregate and learn, then maybe we should try something different because what we're doing isn't working. So I just think we have to carefully negotiate where we want competition to help us and where we want pre-competitive hacks to help us. And I think that a lot of ultra rare diseases and some platform technologies are being held back by the inability to kind of imagine these new pre-competitive paths that we're discussing. So let's educate them about it and sort of show folks that it's in their self-interest. Web browser technology would have gone nowhere if Netscape and Internet Explorer and Safari and whatnot couldn't agree as to what a web page was supposed to look like. It required some open standards and some agreement and some actual working together of software engineers from those various companies to collaborate to say, hey, these are some new ideas that we developed here. Let's pitch them into the pot so we can all use them and make for a better user experience. I think that some of those things are true in drug development too.
Yes, I mean, some standards and harmonization among some of these, even if they're competitors, is absolutely necessary to drive forward some of these things. I mean, another question is convincing legal teams to participate in data sharing. Sometimes the governance is really what drives this and can make or break data sharing, as we all know. Any comments or to move this forward? Has that been a challenge for any of you?
I might just suggest, maybe naively, because I sit in academics and I can't speak from knowing too many corporate lawyers, but that a lot of these tendencies that we're talking about are sort of reflexive. That the policy of patent everything and sort it out later, patent and protect everything and sort it out later, is sort of it's a practice that people are just used to, and that I'd like to think that education and sort of demonstration through a couple of pilot examples will begin to change that. I genuinely think that it will be seen as being beneficial and part of a corporate strategy to actually engage in more of this type of data sharing. But we just have to. But we need folks to actually to carry that message and to demonstrate it and show them that it works.
Completely agree. I think that it is this whole patent protect and silo that really delays, I think, innovation and opportunity and certainly time for patients who need it.
Right. And this is something that we have also seen that far more than the clinical leads who we speak with, I think it's the back end of those institutions, whether they are academic or I guess non like pharmaceutical industry side of the things. It's the most amount of time and discussion and negotiation that actually happens with those stakeholders. And I believe, ultimately it really comes down to the fact that these nowadays, if your patient population has already given the consent for your data to be shared. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the data does not belong to those companies or academic institutions who are doing the clinical trials, but to the patients themselves. Really, because that's where the data is coming from. If you move the discussion to that sort of a sphere where you're able to make a case that, look, your patients themselves are actually okay with the idea of sharing your data, a lot of these type of barriers that exist can be at least partially mitigated.
Yes, absolutely. So I think those are all great points. So probably the last question is, these types of collaborations, data sharing requires quite a bit of bandwidth, business agreements, and large platforms like NICHD. How can bridging between these large networks happen but also allow smaller centers to be supported or allow for participation? Any thoughts?
At risk of continuing to overextend myself with the software analogies, that I think the comment is really well taken. That bespoke negotiations to work out data sharing agreements on a pairwise basis is going to be a nightmare if you want to extend this broadly. And in the software world, there are open source licenses of a variety of different flavors that have been developed and standardized, and you choose the one that's most appropriate to the task. And there's probably a handful of 2 or 3 of them. I don't know what the number would be for, say, rare genetic therapies, but I think that we need to figure that out. I think that we need to say, well, what are the different modes of engagement? What are the different scenarios where a company should use this one or this one or this one? Hopefully no more than 3. And let's just see if those are sufficient to span most of the use cases that we want to enable.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so to wrap us up today, what is one actionable step you would like to see the pediatric gene therapy community take today to ensure data sharing is ethically responsible and impactful for the patients we aim to serve? I mean, if you had a magic wand and anything could happen in the next 5 years, what would you like to see the community do to impact data sharing?
So if I have to, now that we're all talking about what I would wish for it to happen, uh, personally speaking, centralized long-term follow-up registry of all patients, because honestly speaking, a lot of these companies that participate in these, that they're active in gene therapy clinical trial or drug development, small companies. I know this for a fact that a lot of them do not have the resources or bandwidth or I guess that sort of a long-term facilities available to hold and host this 15-year long-term follow-up clinical trial data. So my wish list would be to create a centralized repository, because I think that type of a repository will have a lot of benefit. You can actually get signals that you would ever not be otherwise able to get if you're able to aggregate that long-term follow-up data with obviously adequate protections in place to safeguard the privacy of the data, and IP considerations are being taken care of. That's basically what my wish list would be.
Yeah, that's a huge one, but it's so impactful. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is probably going to be one of the most impactful, because to my understanding, this long-term follow-up issue is one of the biggest challenges in conduct of these clinical trials, because those children or adolescents or older children that are going to be enrolled in those clinical trials will become adults in the middle of those 15 years. And probably you already know that none of the approved clinical trials gene therapies have through those, they're still in their 15-year follow-up period. So nobody
Yes.
knows what will happen 10 years down the line.
Right.
I'll throw out one to give Pat the last word.
Okay.
In the next 5 years, I would love to see this growing field of N1 therapies consolidate its own learnings under one or two centralized databases that are consented for a broad sharing, such that those contributing to this space can also responsibly share what they're learning from it with the community. I think that these cases are special cases that make it easier for us to ask for things like this, as opposed to some other cases that currently have heavy commercial incentives assigned. But just because it's sort of easier to make a hard ask like that doesn't mean it's easy to do. But we're committed to doing it, I think that hopefully could serve as a model for how like open sourcing certain portions of the drug development path and experience, the clinical experience, can lift many boats.
Thank you for your insights, Tim. Pat?
This comment would be, I really believe that we should extend the N=1 collaboratives across diseases. I think that antisense oligonucleotides and/or gene therapy can benefit many. And for those that are left outside that could potentially benefit, I think we all have an obligation to try to enhance these therapies, to make new agreements with companies to share their technology so that we can apply them in this regard, in a bilateral sharing of knowledge, so that we can benefit both those in a common space in terms of their ability to treat and those in a less common space with their inability to treat. Because I think time matters, and it matters for each of these patients. And it is heartbreaking when you have some technology that you think could apply, but you just can't reach it. I think that is our obligation to make sure that the reach is there.
Thank you so much for your insights, all of you, Singh, Pat, and Tim. And thank you for your,
Thanks for including me.
thank you.
Thank you again.
Thanks for leading us, Rebecca.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good day.
All right, everyone. So with that, we're out of time. I also want to take a moment to thank our moderator and all of our panelists for a great discussion today, as well as all of the attendees for your thoughtful questions. On behalf of PGTME, thank you to everyone who has attended, participated, or helped put this webinar together, as well as the rest of our 2024 Lunchtime Lecture Series. There's a link to a feedback survey that's been shared in the chat. If you would take the time to answer a few questions about this year's LLS, we would greatly appreciate it so that we can continue to improve this event in the future. I'd also like to remind you that PGTME exists courtesy of charitable donations, and if you're interested in supporting our educational initiatives, please contact our co-chair, whose name and email address have also been shared in the chat. And with that, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this year's Lunchtime Lecture Series.